Hi, everyone. My name is Milton Valencia. I'm a reporter with the Boston Globe. I just wanted to welcome you to the Boston Globe workshops in partnership with Home Before Dark on Apple TV. If anybody's writing about this, social media, feel free to use the hashtag Globe Events and hashtag Home Before Dark. And this is all relation to the Home Before Dark series. That new season starts on June 11th. This is the second of a series of workshops. This one is titled Developing Sources, with a big focus on developing sources. And I just wanted to say a quick thought that I'm very much in favor of programs like this. I'm a reporter with the Boston Globe. I've been with the Boston Globe for nearly 15 years now, and I got started very much in involvement with programs like this as a high school student, as a college student, writing and working with professionals, including Michelle Johnson from Boston University. So welcome, Michelle. I also worked closely as a high school student with Jason Johnson, a former reporter with the Boston Herald and other newspapers nationwide. He's now involved in communications. So welcome, he's with 617 Media Group. So welcome, Jason Johnson. And I also want to say welcome to the Globe's very own Naomi Martin, who covers covers education for the Globe and part of a team at the Globe. She's been here for several years, so welcome. I've worked closely with her, and I also know she's very much in favor of journalism programs like this. So welcome. If each of you, I work closely. I've provided my thoughts on kind of where you are, but tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Michelle, please.
Sure. Well, the short version is I am actually a former editor for the Boston Globe. I currently teach journalism at Boston University, but I was an editor for the Globe for about 13 years and actually helped launch the newspaper online. We were one of the early newspapers to actually go digital. And then I worked pretty much as a freelancer. I covered personal tech for the Globe business section, and then ended up in journalism education. So happy to be here.
Great, welcome. Jason, a little bit about yourself as well.
Sure, give you a thumbnail. My background is very much a longtime reporter for several years. My first job was at the Dallas Morning News. Then I was at the Boston Herald. Then I was at the San Francisco Chronicle. And my last journalism role was as assistant managing editor at a newspaper in Minnesota. And then I made the switch and started working in the public relations field. And during that time, I took a few years off and taught high school journalism for 2 years and college journalism for a year.
Great. And Naomi, a little bit about yourself, please. What you've done with the Globe and before that.
Sure. So at the Globe currently, I cover education. I'm on the Great Divide team, which focuses on inequities in education. Before I came to the Globe, I worked at the Dallas Morning News. Jason, I'm sad we didn't overlap there, but it was a great newspaper in Dallas, Texas. And I was an investigative reporter there. I also covered criminal justice and local government. And then before that, I was in New Orleans, where I started out. I went to college there at Tulane University. So after that, I stayed in the city and covered mostly crime and criminal justice issues for the newspaper, the Times-Picayune, which is there.
That's great. And again, quickly about myself, Milton Valencia. I've been with the Globe for about 15 years. I am about to cover the mayor's race in the city of Boston. I've also worked on a police accountability team. I've run the gamut, really. I've covered the federal court system, and I was a street reporter, pretty much the breaking news, morning and night shift. So I've worked on all spectrums as well. Born and raised in Massachusetts as well, covering community events, community reporting, which we're going to get into, is with the Telegram Gazette in Worcester, for anyone out there, and also with the Herald News in Fall River and the Pawtucket Times in Rhode Island. So I'm very much involved, and my experience has been in the community reporting, community-based reporting. So I'm glad to talk to you all about that. One note is we do have a Q&A section. If anybody wants to ask any questions live, we encourage that. That's part of the exchange of journalism, which we're going to get into. And I can't stress enough that I was involved in programs like this. I met Michelle, I met Jason as a high school student participating in programs. And just a plug, we're here to talk about high school journalism and middle school journalism, scholastic journalism, really, and some of the Apple TV programming that you'll hear more about. But I do want to say quickly, for any of you who are interested in pursuing a career in news, or if there are any teens watching who love to write, the Boston Globe just launched a Young Reporters competition inspired by the Home Before Dark series on Apple TV. So what that means is anyone ages 14 to 18 can submit a local news story they wrote for a chance to win a full admission to Boston University's pre-college journalism program, the Summer Journalism Academy for this summer. Submissions are due by May 31st. I know that was a mouthful, but if you want to know more about it, please go to globe.com/home before dark to hear a little bit more about that programming. And again, Q&A, if anybody, we can put that in the chat form or kind of put that out there, but it's a great program. So I encourage all of you, students and teachers to know more about it and consider it. So as we talk about student journalism, Michelle, one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you a bit was you and I have chatted about your students at Boston University and the coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing. And we've shared our experiences. And we came to learn that your students were doing the exact work that I was doing as a reporter for the Boston Globe. So it's real life journalism. Can you tell me about your experiences there, but also what students get involved in and how it's real, it's journalism?
Yeah, we have the kind of program where it is real, and we have our students out covering stories right alongside professional journalists. And the interesting thing for the marathon coverage was that we were there for every single press conference, every single event. And in fact, we were covering the race that day when it happened. So I actually had students at the finish line who called and texted me and said, "Hey, we heard a couple of loud bangs and people are running, And I just said, go for it, and they swung into action and pretty much covered this thing straight through. I think it's really key for students to understand that they can be involved in the bigger stories. Yes, you should cover your school and, what's on the cafeteria menu or, issues that are happening with the principal or whatever. But if you have an opportunity, get out into the community and do things, do stories that are impacting your community if you can, because that's really great experience. And also, as you get into college, you'll be doing that. So if you can get that experience early on, it's fantastic.
Naomi, what kind of experience do you see students getting involved in covering the education team, but also kind of doing this work, supporting journalism and being a professional?
Sure. So I have been, working closely with 826 Boston, which is a nonprofit that is involved in some of the Boston public schools. And I know that they have students working on publications for them and doing op-eds, which is really interesting. So we did a workshop with them on how to write op-eds and how to work on reporting, because a lot of students, they're really used to TikTok and Twitter, where you don't necessarily need to back up what you're saying with actual reporting or facts. And so it's really, important to understand the difference with that and like an actual piece of publication, published writing that needs to have evidence behind it and facts. And so that's been great. And I also just think, like Michelle was saying, the student newspapers and student media, student radio stations or TV stations are great ways to get experience. And then, internships are also crucial. And most internships, will hire people based on their school media experience. So that's sort of the path that I took, and I know a lot of students take.
And Jason, you've worked both ends of the spectrum as well as a professional journalist, also in communications, but as a teacher involved in several programs. So before we get into sourcing and what good sourcing is, let's talk about journalism. What do you tell students journalism is? What does the capital J journalism mean to you, I guess?
Good question. To me, it means telling people amazing, riveting stories about things they do know about and about things they don't know about. That's the big idea, and that's the goal we shoot for. You don't always get there, but that's what you should try to do with every story you write. Figure out what are people interested in. Figure out what's interesting that's going on in your community, in a group that you're involved in, and then try to tell that story, to share the experiences of the people who are involved in that, so that a wider group of folks can see it, hear it, read it, and kind of put themselves into that space. And I think that's when we do that right, that's the best thing we do as communicators, is because it helps people to experience something that they might not have any idea is going on, and expand their understanding of the world.
And when we tell about storytelling and telling about people's lives and telling about experiences in the world, there's the storytelling part of it, but there's also a connection that we share. And there's a line that has to be drawn between the two, that opinion writing. I think, Naomi, you mentioned op-ed a bit, that opinion writing, I believe, or I feel, but that you have to straddle that with the idea of telling someone else's experience and putting it into their words and sharing it from an objective, neutral position. So Michelle, can you tell a little bit about the difference between a news story and an opinion piece, and the importance of sometimes staying away from the opinion?
Yeah, that's something that, working with younger people. In fact, I work with college students and with high school students through the New England High School Journalism Collaborative. And I think one of the things that students often get confused about is that they will watch something on television, or they'll read something and the reporter or the commentator is expressing personal opinion. So I think they're not quite clear on, well, what's news and, what's opinion. And in general, if you find yourself using the word I or we, there's probably some opinion involved, unless you're doing a feature story about, a vacation that you took, But I think you have to be careful about sticking to the facts, sort of letting the people that you're interviewing, letting your sources tell the story in a way that, people will understand, versus you sort of injecting, personal opinion into it. It can be hard. But the bigger issue I find with my students is that they're afraid to contact sources initially. They're afraid to contact people. They can be scared to walk up to somebody on the street and ask them questions. And I can imagine if you're even younger, in middle or high school, that could be intimidating too. But what I usually say to them is, if they know you're a student, they will probably cut you some slack. You can play the student card and, sort of act like you don't know much about something. And they may tell you things they would not tell a professional reporter, because they think, oh, this kid, So I would, to be honest, take a little bit of advantage of that and just, be bold, walk up to them, and, all they can do is say no.
Yeah.
And I also think it's like a numbers game too. Like, I get turned down all the time by people, but more often than not, people do want to talk. Everyone is like the star of their own show in their head, right? So they want to, share their story and share what they've gone through in their lives, their experiences with things. To them, it's important, to them it matters, and it matters to everyone else too, in a larger sense. So I think for the most part, people will say yes. And then for the ones that say no, just brush it off and keep trying, because there will be plenty more people who will say yes.
Right. And I know, being a reporter as well, Jason, you made this point where part of what we're covering are things we see, but also things we don't know and we're learning. So it's a great learning experience. And I think people appreciate that when you're trying to take that time to understand what they're saying and tell their story, and really educate yourself at the same time while you're educating your readers. I think people get that. And it just makes the whole approach to storytelling and learning these new experiences, as Jason mentioned, it makes it easier and worthwhile. That's the best part of the job. Naomi, you touched upon the idea of getting to talk to people and going out to talk to people. So when you're approaching a story, how do you develop who you want to chat with, who's worth chatting with? When we talk about sources, how do you find out who's worth talking to?
Sure. So I've covered a really wide range of beats, and I think for every beat, it's a similar process. I start out with thinking about, like, what is my goal here? For criminal justice or education, like, I want to know, is this system really working for the people it's intended to serve? And if not, how, where are the issues that people are, experiencing? And so to get to the answers of that, you can make a big list basically of everyone you feel like you need to talk to. And you might not know their names right away, but you can at least know what position they would have. So for example, with the cops beat, I knew when I started in Dallas that I needed to know a homicide detective. I needed to know somebody in the administration, ideally a chief or assistant chief. I needed to know some police attorneys who both represent cops and those who are suing the police department. I needed to know a lot of community members and people who are watching the police. So you have to think about like who else is investigating whatever I'm investigating. That's a really key piece. So with the education beat, I'm doing the same thing with Boston Public Schools and with the State Department of Education. Who else is monitoring them? Who else is investigating them? Who interacts with them on a daily basis? Teachers, principals, students, parents, but also all these organizations and interest groups are also really important to talk to. So that's just like typical beat stuff. And those are the people that you want to ideally be in contact with on a regular basis, which is where texting really comes in handy, because no one has time to talk to everybody all the time, but you can at least send a quick text and say, how's your week going? Anything I should know about? Or you can jump on a quick Zoom call. That didn't used to be an option. You know, I used to go to a lot more coffees. When I'm working on a specific story, there's usually a question that you're trying to answer, and the question might change over the course of reporting, but at least at the beginning, there's a certain question you're trying to answer. And I just try to think about who is like the firsthand account that would know these, you know, the answer to this question, or who would at least get me closer to that person. So, for example, if it's, you know, I heard about in November that a lot of students weren't having contact with their teachers on a regular basis. Some were going entire weeks without hearing from their teachers during remote learning. And so I figured the students would really be the firsthand account of that. But, you know, it's hard to find those people. So I started with some parents groups and asked them if they had heard about it. And then eventually found some students who were able to talk to me and share their schedules, which is also an important thing, is you don't want to just base your story on people, but also documents. So once you have those two levels, it's really good.
And Jason, I would always tell students that before I even start writing, I would need to feel like the authority on the subject matter. So whether I was covering a trial in federal court, I would have read every document that was there. So I was the authority on the subject. And also the mayor's race. Now that I'm covering the mayor's race, I try to go about knowing who the candidates are, who their PR people are, what their policy platforms are, so that I'm knowledgeable. Can you talk a little bit more about that and your experiences covering them? You know, working at different newspapers and how you go about that?
Yeah, so getting an understanding, that's really important. And so what I would do is, depending on my beat, to kind of talk about sources and understanding, I would kind of go along two tracks. One, I would kind of get out of the office, get out of my chair, and as much as possible, you know, if let's say when I was covering cops, I would, you know, go to it if I was at a crime scene or something was going on, and I would go and, you know, I'd spend time just talking to the uniform officers, getting to know them, and not necessarily asking them specific questions all the time about this incident, but just talking to them, or meeting detectives and just talking to them and developing a rapport. I used to go to a bar that was frequented by officers and just hang out and just talk to folks, and, you know, and so they would have a comfort level with me, and that would help in just learning a little bit about their perspective on their work, and also about cases that were going on. Then I would also kind of do the other track, which is, you know, which is mentioned before, figure out who's in charge of what office, who are the people that work in that office, and when you're, you know, whether it was the police department going to, you know, different offices within the police department building, or when I covered, say, the San Francisco Housing Authority, going to the authority and going into people's offices, asking them, hey, you know, you got 10 minutes to just talk to me about how this works, how the Section 8 program works, and break it down for me, and just talking to them, and then going on my own and reading the policies of the agency, so that I understood, you know, how things work, going to the offices within each housing community and talking to them. And so, you know, the informal track and the formal track really helps you to kind of get an understanding of whatever it is you're covering, and you know, puts you a little bit ahead of the field when you're trying to develop a story, or get a better understanding of the story.
And can I just say something about sort of the flip side, which is that when you're doing that important work, it helps you to weed out the stuff that you should not be engaging with, or is not necessarily going to get you where you need to be. Because I cover tech, and not just tech, but personal tech, and I knew like what the latest software was, what the latest cell phones were, whatever. When I would get a press release or get somebody contacting me about a product saying this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, I knew that that was a little bit of hyperbole, and that helped me, sort of focus on, what I was covering. So that piece of it, the research, the background research, is really critical.
Michelle, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to follow up and ask you, not only that's the street reporting, the personal level reporting, buying or seeing that agenda, but in so much with digital work and digital computer assisted reporting and social media reporting that's done today. How do you also weed out that bad information? I'm talking about the misleading Facebook posts or Instagram posts. How do you go about that when we're talking about online and social media?
Well, it's funny. The first thing that I saw from the Boston Marathon bombing was an Instagram post. One of my students said, "Come look at this." And she pointed to a picture that somebody had taken from above a building. And there was what looked like red ink on the ground. And we realized it was, somebody was saying it was blood. We had no idea. We were not physically there. And I said, well, check some other sources. So she starts looking around, checking the AP wire and everything, and sees nothing. And I said, okay, go ahead and run it, but say that it's unverified. And of course, it turned out to be, we were lucky in that sense that it wasn't just some joke that somebody threw a balloon out there with some red, paint in it or something. But it can be extraordinarily difficult to stay on top of what's happening with social media. And what I would say is that I used to say, don't run with anything straight out of social media. And I think we've gotten to a point where that's not always possible. I think it's how you frame it if you use it, and make sure that people understand that you're not saying this is absolute truth here, this is what's happening. But obviously, as soon as you can, you try and vet as much as you can, as quickly as you can. And then, come back at it, even later with more detail. But I think, the whole digital piece of this, which the world I live in, I primarily teach digital. It's complicated things. It's also, there are some upsides to it, and that we get, information faster. But it's certainly made the job of reporting and also dealing with sources harder, because then you're out there trying to talk to people on Twitter. Say, how many times have you seen a tweet that says, "Hey, I'm a reporter for so-and-so, I'd love to talk to you about X." I mean, whenever a huge story happens, you see those notes all the time. And I'm sure that there are people who get turned off by that because they say so. They'll say, I saw a woman the other day saying, "Can you reporters stop trying to contact my mother about this story?" She's overwhelmed. So, there's a line here. And I think it can be tough, not to cross it when there's breaking news.
Right. And I remember as well, that's the fine line. We talked a bit about digital and social media, but just back in the day, the old police scanner. You hear something on the scanner, but doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean you can go with it. And that means going to a place, to a scene, as Jason mentioned, and verifying this information. And that can be difficult. It's our job to kind of go and get information, but it's a delicate approach that you work with sources. I want to pause here for a question that came from the group. So anyone, again, looking to be more involved and have a question, feel free to go into the Q&A. And speaking of social media, again, anyone tweeting or writing about this, feel free to use the hashtag Globe Events and hashtag Home Before Dark. So a quick question from the audience. So Michelle, I'm going to go to you on this first, because we talked a bit about it, but Naomi, Jason, weigh in. Why can't high school journalists cover town news? Local news is suffering. Can high school journalists fill the need and get experiences through this?
I think they can. Although, again, covering local news can be fraught with issues, because, a lot of these committees and stuff really don't necessarily want specific information getting out there. But I think this is an instance where if you're younger, you might be able to talk your way in. In other cases, you might not, because you may be, you're part of the school system, for instance. If you're trying to cover, issues related to education, you might not be able to get in on that. I think we should be looking at all the options here. I spoke to a high school student just this past week who is working with her local newspaper to do a project on what it's like to be a person of color in a mostly white community that she lives in. That's a perspective that essentially she's an expert on. So I think if you can contact your local paper and say, I think I have a unique perspective here, would you be interested in a story? That might be a way to kind of, get your foot in the door for doing that kind of work.
I also think,
oh,
sorry, I was going to say, I also think like high school students especially, are sort of a really important voice on issues related to education, since they are the ones experiencing it themselves, and everyone else is supposed to be sort of working in service of them getting a good education. And so in a sense, they are a very knowledgeable person already on that topic, but that doesn't mean that they can only cover education. I think, high school students are sort of equipped to handle all kinds of topics. I just think it's important to work closely with, someone who's had more experience, who can give you advice, because, even now I've been doing this job for like 15 years and I still struggle with, the thorny issues that can come up in any line of reporting. And you need to have someone you can bounce those ideas off of and not just go it alone, because that's when you can run into trouble.
And Jason, a related question, just to follow on that perfectly, I was going to ask about your work in communication. So Jason, you worked in the public sector for a bit for a government agency as a communications person, but also in the private sector, more of a consultant work, doing communications work still, but more in that sense of personal rather than government work, so working for a client. Whole point being, you've been on the other side. You've been the person who asked the questions, but also the person who answered the questions and provided that info. So one of the other questions I go to you on that point is, as a reader, not a reporter, a journalist, how do I determine whether a news source is delivering reliable information? So how do you get that information and make sure it's accurate and trustworthy?
I think the idea is you want to make sure that you're as close to the primary source as possible. And for those who might not know, the primary source is either somebody who directly witnessed, has the information, or is an expert on something, or the reporter was there and saw the situation unfold. Those are kind of the general terms for primary sources. So you want to be making sure that you're taking something that came firsthand. So you don't, that's why, it's cautious to say, well, my sister's cousin's aunt forwarded me this post, and you don't know where that thing came from. And then you're walking around, waving it in the air like, oh, well, it's true. But somebody could have just made that up out of whole cloth. The idea is that if you can get somebody who in their story has, information from, like I said, the housing authority, and it has the figures of what they've been spending money on, then you can publish that, and somebody can say, oh, okay, this is coming directly from them. And then on top of that, then you can go to the place where that money was supposedly spent, and you talk to the residents who live there, and they can tell you whether or not this new thing that it was built or not. Then that's another primary source to verify what the housing authority said. And now you're really getting into the meat of what's happening on that issue, because you've got what the officials are saying, and then you've got what the people on the ground who are living that experience are saying, and then you put those two together, and then you don't have to make an opinion. It's not your opinion; it's facts that lead the reader or the viewer to understand, oh, okay, something is really going on here that's not right, or to say, okay, yeah, they said they did this, the people there said this has happened and it's great, and you're not editorializing, you're just showing facts to lead to a conclusion that's truthful. And so it's all about getting as many verifiable or primary sources as possible, and kind of layering them on top of each other. And if you come across a story that has those kinds of things, then you can know this is verifiable, this is truthful, and to be careful of folks who are just making posts, who spout things and have no information, or if they do include links to something, it's a link to something that looks incredibly sketchy or doesn't even address the original point that they were making.
Yeah, and the second part of that question, it was multi-layered, so forgive me. But the second part of it is your job is to kind of provide that information and make sure the reporter is considering information that he or she may not have considered before, or given enough weight to. So how do you go about that as well in trying to talk to the reporter, and it's not spin, it's useful information? Tell me a little bit about
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. What you try to do is, what I try to do if I'm in that position is I try to use facts. I don't believe in, trying to mislead to throw somebody off a story, because the danger with that is that, they find out the truth and then they come back at you. And then you're caught having lied or trying to mislead. But what I try to do is to say, okay, this is what you have. This is what I have. And I can confirm A, B, and C. And I can tell you also that D, E, and F are not true. And here's why they're not true. And so to me, that's what you want to do, is to address their questions directly and make sure that, if you're trying to make sure that you're clearing something up that you think is wrong, to have the facts to do that. I'll try to make it as general as possible, but I had a situation where a reporter called me and somebody had sent them a tip about an employee at an agency, doing something wrong, and it was just a statement and a picture. And I said, okay. And I looked into it and I found out what the deal was. And I called him back and I said, look, this is what you have, but you don't know that they weren't, on duty. This is not, them at the work site. And here's their, schedule. And, so it explained to the reporter that the person who sent you this was really misleading you with the information they gave you. And actually, what happened was, to me, I counted this as a victory. When the reporter kind of verified and found that out, they just didn't do the story. So, it wasn't a case of me trying to lie to them. It was, hey, here's the full understanding of what's going on. And, somebody might be trying to use you, and I'm giving you this information. And I think also helped that they knew me to an extent that they knew that I wasn't going to give them false information, that, I had a good enough track record that they said, well, if he's saying this, if Jason's saying this, then, it's accurate and it's true.
And on that, it's all about trust. That level of trust is kind of where you're getting at. So Naomi, when you come to a new state and you get put on this new beat that a lot of people pay attention to, the education beat is important in many ways. How do you sort out the Jasons, the people you can trust, and the people with the agenda, the spin, because they're out there as well. So how do you trust your source and develop your source, but trust your source?
Yeah, I think honestly, everybody has a little bit of an agenda, and recognizing that is sort of step one, and understanding that their agenda might be like completely, well-intentioned, but they still have a point of view and often a reason for talking to you. Like before, when I said most people will talk to you, not only just to share their story, but they also do have an agenda that they're usually pushing. And so it's important to kind of first talk to them about that. Like, what is your goal of your organization, or why did you start this parents group, or what thing are you trying to do here? And once you have an understanding of that, then you can sort of decide how much credibility to give different, sources or different sides of their different parts of what they tell you. So, I'll just give you guys an example. There's a group in Massachusetts called the Massachusetts Parents United, and they're a really big group that have a lot of parents in it. And the leader of it is a woman who's a mother of students with disabilities, and she has a lot of experience that I think is very valid for a lot of different reasons. But she does have some funding sources that are controversial. And so I've gotten people emailing me saying, why do you talk to her? Why do you quote her? She's funded by this controversial thing. And I don't think that solely receiving money from a controversial source is enough reason to not talk to someone who does have valid personal experience and talks to a lot of parents around the state on a regular basis. So I think it's just something to be aware of and know if you need to disclose it in your story. Like if your story is going to discuss something that and you can talk to your editor about this. This is like where I was saying, it's really important to have a mentor or an editor or both, who you can talk to about when you need to disclose certain things to your readers. But I think that it's really important to just like listen to the criticisms. Like when people tell you, why are you talking to this person? Listen to what they're saying about the person, but also listen to the actual person and decide for yourself with your editor whether this is someone that you can take as a credible source. Because people are complicated, people are multifaceted, and there are people in our community who have gone to prison who are now really important political figures who, we're not just going to write them off forever because they had a criminal incident in their past. So, it's important to just kind of understand the full complexity of humans and know that, as journalists, we also have our own opinions that we have to, kind of quiet down and not let drive the show. But it's kind of a fallacy to say that, as journalists, we don't have any opinions, because obviously we do. We just aren't supposed to let them interfere with our work.
And we're talking very much at the personal, the human source as well. Michelle, you were a copy editor for a long time, so you were the gatekeeper pretty much of what gets into the paper. Can you talk a bit about not only the human sourcing, but also the research sourcing, the difference between an actual fact that you find online versus something that was spouted on Wikipedia? How do you go about telling your students the difference of not only personal trusting your human source, but trusting your online source, the social media source?
Yeah, that's something we talk about a lot because we produce work that gets run by third-party, professional newsrooms. So we have to be careful about what we send out there. I always, well, as an editor myself, I had quite a bit of experience. Well, in a sense, I want to trust my reporter, to have done the work and done the background. But there's the old term, trust but verify. So if you see something, particularly if it raises a red flag for you, then that's your job to check that out. Sort of come behind them and make sure that that information is valuable and truthful to the story. I teach my students to look for reliable sources. Can be, and reliable with quotes around it, could be a study or a survey that comes out of a university, not so much out of a third-party organization, because sometimes they have a particular spin that they're trying to put on a report. I used to tell them that government resources were a good place to go. But after what's happened over the last 4 years and the way that, certain departments were kind of, hamstrung about releasing information, I feel a little bit skittish about that at this point. So, and when it comes to social media, as I said, I have them, test whatever it is against something else that's, not a social media source. So it's a mix, I would say. The key thing I tell them is that you obviously don't just go with one source on a story. You need to look around and see who else is, a player here, and look for the documents, look for the data, look for whatever it is that's going to strengthen the story. So that's why I sort of love the editorial process, is why I started out as an editor, was because I liked that work. I like being part of the team that was vetting that information and making sure that it was in good shape before it was published. Later on, I started writing and became a reporter, but initially I figured that was a really key position to be in a newsroom. And by the way, guys, there are more jobs in news than just being a reporter or a TV anchor. I know you guys see people on TV all the time. There are jobs behind the camera, behind the scenes. There are editing jobs on the, in print newsrooms and in online newsrooms. And you should really think about, what else might be a good fit for you in addition to being a reporter or a TV anchor. There's more of those jobs out there.
That's right. Even photographers are out there. Video
photographers, yes.
They're on the scene. Sometimes they are feeding information to reporters. Absolutely agree. Naomi, on Michelle's point, any red flags for you? Anything that stands out that says this is someone I'm not going to trust?
Usually when they ramble for a long time and then say, this is the biggest story of your life. This is, this is the Watergate of Boston or whatever. That's usually like a red flag. Cause every time you hear that, you're like, oh, no, it's not, you know. uh, but maybe it is that one time, and I, just, discounted it. But I think most of the time it's not usually that big of a deal when somebody says stuff like that. But on the flip side, I do think it is important to try to listen to people who are passionate and coming to you, because reaching out to reporters isn't, necessarily, the easiest thing to always do. So I try to hear people out when they do reach out to me. And I'm not saying that it might not be an important story to them. It just, is it an important enough story for the Globe to spend time on? That's a different question sometimes. So that's one of my red flags. I'm trying to think what else, like just in the sense of, if it seems like it really is an agenda thing where, somebody's really against the MCAS, for example, and they are trying to get me to sort of, push that agenda, or somebody's really against, closing schools, and they're trying to get me to push the agenda that every kid has suffered with, remote learning. Like, obviously that's not true, because every kid is different, and some kids have thrived, but a lot of kids have not. But things have a lot of nuance, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is you have to sort of listen to like all the different perspectives and not just go with the first person that comes to you with like the loudest, most like egregious sounding thing.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, I'm going to ask you to pick up on that through your work on the other side, on or as a reporter, but also communications. I'm going to spin this from a Q&A as well, though, just kind of add. And again, just reminding people, if they want to ask a question, go to the Q&A. But the question is, please pick up on Naomi's point, but how do we find a perspective that is unique to us? So how do you sell that story in the sense of, this is important, this is what you need to know, without it always being an agenda? How do you make that important?
Yeah, I think what you try to do is find the humanity in a story, or find the realness in a story. So I, as a teacher, I had a student who was, in my journalism class, and was at high school level, and was kind of struggling to figure out how to write and what, how to really do this. And I talked to him a little bit about the things that he liked, and found out that he was deeply into skateboarding. And so I said, well, look, aren't they trying to start a skate club, at the school? And he's like, yeah. And he knew everything about it. I said, okay, so here's your story. You know about this. Now you're going to do the reporting to verify what you know and to give you real in-depth information. You're going to talk to school officials. You're going to talk to people who are backing it. You're going to talk to the students, and then you're going to write your story. And it was like, after that, he was on automatic. It just fell into place for him, because one, he had that interest, and two, he knew where these people were. He knew where the kids were, the real kids who loved this, and why it was a passion for them. He then went to talk to the school officials about, why is this a good idea? Why is it a bad idea? What are the problems? Insurance, that sort of thing. And then talk to folks in the local community who had skateboard stores, and were like, well, we would support it, and came back and did this wonderful, amazing story. And it just all clicked into place, because when he could identify it and make it real, and then find the people that made it real, it all clicked into place for him.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of getting it. And then and bear with me, now I'm trying to figure out your second part of your question.
You kind of answered it, and I keep throwing those double layer questions at you, I guess. But it was, I guess, when I was asking Naomi about a red flag, is there anything that you have a red flag? Well, let me start again, I guess. Is there anything that you have for reporters from the communication side that are red flags for reporters?
Yeah, to be careful of what you're getting, and that's why I'm going to go back to something that we talked about earlier, is you doing that research and the background information before you even start reporting. You just try to learn as much as possible, and then during your reporting, you figure things out. And so to me, I would always be excited when I got a red flag person talking to me, because it was like, somebody had walked into my mousetrap, because I knew that what they were telling me was wrong. And so I would let them, kind of spin up for a while, and then come back and just very calmly say, well, you said A, B, and C, but isn't it true that, D, E, F? and then see how they responded. And that sometimes is as revealing as getting truthful information, because then you figure out where this person is coming, what the spin of their organization is, and how much will they use false information to try to meet their goals. And so that can then inform your story when you're writing it, and give people that, that secondary layer of, oh, this is what's going on here. So the red flags are really great. And to me, the more facts you have, the more understanding you have, the easier it is for you to spot the red flags. And then you go to the next level of, okay, now that I know this is a red flag, how am I going to work this into my reporting?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that goes to the point you made earlier about being the authority on a subject. When you're the authority on the subject, you get this insight, and you know what's spanned and what's not, what red flags are and what aren't. And I also want to circle back on a great point you made about writing what you care about with the skateboarding. I would tell students, if you like music, write about music. If you like sports, write about sports. If you like news, I'd watch my city council meeting when I was 19 years old. If you like news, follow the news. But I promise you, you're going to learn more. And that's the great thing about this business, is you appreciate more, you see more, and you educate yourself. And through that, you educate your readers. We're going to go into a Q&A, some pre-submitted questions, but I just want to keep this an open one. A lot of the questions related to Zoom. And no longer, I think, Naomi, you mentioned coffee meetings. Coffee meetings are a lot more difficult now than they used to be. But what's the importance of a coffee meeting? But how can you kind of replace it through Zoom meetings or phone conversations? How can you source in the digital world?
Yeah, it's really hard. I'm not going to lie. I miss coffee meetings a lot. I think you get a lot better kind of trust with somebody when you can actually meet them in person, and you have a lot more kind of like easy, natural conversation like flowing, and doesn't feel so stilted and like awkward. And we have to talk about work because this is like a Zoom thing that we're staring at each other, and it feels very like fraught sometimes that I don't think like meeting in person always does. Actually, I think meeting in person just usually doesn't. So I really prefer meeting in person, but I know right now, I guess the benefit though is that you don't have to like deal with, traffic or Boston's crappy transportation system. So that part is nice about Zoom. And so people can like fit you in a lot easier. And it's not as inconvenient for anybody. And when I have coffee or Zoom with somebody, I try to ask them, questions like, what's the biggest challenge that you or your organization are facing over the next year? Trying to look out for like, what is the big kind of conflict that is happening for them right now? And what are some of the key like milestones in the next year that I should be aware of? What's coming up, that sort of thing. In addition to like, what keeps you up at night? What are your biggest worries? What's not going covered? Usually when you're new on a beat, they might be more freely telling you like what they think, the newspaper hasn't covered well before or hasn't covered at all because it hasn't been your fault, right? So you're new. Who else should I talk to is another one that I always ask, toward the end. And that way you get sort of a bigger web. And just one other thing on sourcing, having covered a lot of agencies that, people can get in trouble for talking to the media, like police, or if you're in, federal government, or there's a lot of agencies where people really aren't allowed to talk to the press. And I would just try to go through the ones that can, like usually there's a few that can, like in the union or whatever. And then also formers. So you can talk to people, you can find former people who have either been quoted in stories in the past or who are on LinkedIn or Facebook as being, former employees of that agency, and talk to them. And usually they're retired and they're kind of bored and they're happy to talk. Or people who have become professors, people who have become different jobs. They're usually really happy to talk about their previous job. And then you can ask them to introduce you to people who are on that job now, and that person will be more likely to talk to you because you kind of got vouched for by their, mentor or whatever. So.
And Michelle, when you have students who are eager to take one of your classes and get out and do journalism and do that storytelling, but they're hamstrung in today's world, what have you been telling them over the last year?
That's funny. I should just say ditto to what Naomi just said, because we're pretty much working in the same mode. And actually, the upside is that they're getting that experience. So when they get internships, they sort of already know how to do this. We're Zoom based too. And this is coming from a culture where usually a professor would tell you, well, do not interview anybody by email. You know, you either have to do it in person or, you know, you have to get on the phone. So we've always encouraged our students to do face-to-face, but obviously you haven't been able to do that in the last year. So I've you know, sort of loosened my restrictions in a way that I never would have in the past. And I would say that on the whole, we've been really successful at it. I feel like, you know, they're still coming back with good quotes and, you know, good background information, but you know, it is very different. And again, some people have done really well at it because they're, you know, they're introverts. They sort of thrive. I'm an introvert. I sort of thrive on digital platform. And then there are other folks who are extroverts who are just itching to get back, you know, in person with people. But it's I think you can still you can obviously do the job and you can get legitimate information from people, you know, from a Zoom platform. But just know that there may be some nuances that you know you might miss that you would get in person. The other downside that we haven't mentioned of the Zoom stuff is that if you're doing video, if you're doing a video package or something, the Zoom video can be horrible. So some of our newscasts, you know, have been the quality of the images hasn't been as great because, you know, depending on the equipment, you know, that we're using, but there are a lot of things to factor in.
There are many layers. And Jason, I was going to follow up on you, but this question came in exactly on this point. And you've done a lot of street reporting, I call it, police reporting, back in the day, as you said, going out to scenes. One of the questions was, how personal should we get in an interview? Is there an ethical limit to how much you should ask someone?
I think you have to kind of feel your way along. There are some stories. So, like for example, I did a lot of stories in the 90s when, you know, homicide rates were spiking in Dallas and in Boston, where, you know, I was talking to families who had loved ones who died, you know, and doing stories about that. So you kind of have to talk about personal things. You have to kind of, you know, ask tough questions sometimes, but you try to do it as respectfully as possible. One of the things that I always would try to do is say, you know, let me ask the questions that can paint a fuller picture of this person who died or their family, but do it in a respectful way. So like one example I'll give, it always stuck with me, is when I was at the Herald, I talked to this family, and they had a son who had been shot and killed. And the mother, you know, mother loved her son and you know, thought the world of him, and was showing me pictures of him. And I noticed in one picture, he had thrown up a sign, which I knew in the Boston neighborhoods was a gang sign. And of course, the mother had no idea. And so I didn't, you know, then start saying to her, well, hey, you know, look at this picture and this, you know, did you know, because it's obvious she just had no idea. But what I would then do is, you know, and she gave me that picture. And what I did is talk to other folks in the neighborhood who knew him. And then, you know, friends and stuff would tell me, oh, well, yeah, you know, and so in the story, I was then able to explain, hey, you know, and police confirmed that they thought it might, you know, it looked like it was gang related. And so I could, you know, put that into the story and be truthful while not, you know, causing undue pain of, you know, confronting the mother with, oh, you know, because it's obvious she didn't know that information. And so you just try to be as respectful as possible, but you make sure that you keep in mind that your first duty is to paint as truthful a picture as possible.
That's right. And it's a great point. And so share one of my own stories on that very difficult question and answer. I remember covering a fire. It was a tragic incident, but I had to knock on the door of the family, and that's always tough to do as a reporter. But my goal, and the only reason I ever did it, wasn't to cross a line or to cross a boundary, but was to share that person's story and tell what happened. And there was this one situation where a man, he was a hero, tried to save his sister, and the world would not have known that if we didn't get the full spectrum from the family and from police. And we were really able to tell that man's story. And he was recognized after his passing with a hero award. And we're only a national hero award. And it was only able to do that because we we decided that story is worth telling, but also we needed to kind of talk to the family and ask the family to talk to us. So it's a very difficult approach, but it's one that at the end of the day, with that common goal of sharing stories we spoke about at the beginning, it's one that you have to kind of at least try and make that available. Let me go into one more of the questions here. This is a current events one, I guess. I majored in English and completed the journalism program at UNH under the legend Don Murray before it became a major and he passed. I've always appreciated the need to rely on reliable sources, but many people believe Facebook, what Trump says. How can I influence steadfast non-believers seeking out the facts, of educating them in hopes of them seeing the importance of facts and reliable sources when they just follow the crowd and don't think for themselves? So we hear a lot about mainstream media and these media with these agendas. How do you separate the two? And I asked that one because there are a few questions in there that were related. So how do you develop not only good sourcing of people to talk to, but source of where do you get the news? Michelle, how do you decide where you get your news?
How do I decide where I get my news? Well, one of the things that I talk to my students a lot about is because they're looking for, trustworthy news sources. And sometimes, cable news comes up. And one of the things I'll say is we'll start by understanding the difference between news and commentators. If you look at Chris Cuomo as a commentator, even Rachel Maddow is a commentator. I don't know Tucker Carlson's background, but he's probably a commentator as well. What they do is significantly different from what you see on, NBC Evening News or, CBS Evening News or your local news station. They are the equivalent in a lot of ways of an opinion columnist in print. So be clear what it is that you're looking at, and calling news to start with. Then secondly, look at the, I don't want to say higher end, I will say news organizations that have a history of being trustworthy to start with, and then look at how other news organizations are covering the same story and what they're saying in comparison, because that can sometimes give you a clue as to how reputable, this organization is. Are they knocking the story? Are they running sort of conspiracy theory kind of stuff instead of, the other factual stuff that the mainstream news organizations are running? You want to be careful about that. But I want to go back to something about trying to convince people who don't believe in stuff. I would say that that's not possible or the goal of journalism. And there's been a lot of research done that shows that you really don't move the needle on those people. If they believe in that stuff, they're going to get very entrenched in it. What the experts say is that it's more successful to do that sort of thing in person. If you essentially listen to the person who is saying all these things and then say back to them, well, I think what I hear you saying is you believe A, B, and C. And once they understand that you've heard them, and then you say, okay, I have a different opinion on this. I believe that C, D, and E is correct, and here's why. They actually will sometimes listen. If anybody feels like they haven't been listened to, they will hunker down and and push back. I don't know if you can sort of apply that to everyday daily reporting, but I will say that in general, most people will not be swayed, because frankly, if they were swayed, it would have happened in the last 4 years, because most news organizations went with calling out the lies, running the factual stuff, and people still did not move. That did not move the needle for a lot of people. So I'm not even sure it's possible, to be honest.
And that's the friction with the reporter source at times as well. Whether it be, writing stories that people want to dismiss because you're from a certain news agency, or because you come from a certain kind of political realm or communications side of things, you have an agenda. And I think that's what the whole summary of our conversation has been, is how do you trust that source and learn from that source? And I think that's what journalism does. So on that note, I'm going to look for any parting thoughts, anything I didn't ask or that some of our readers didn't ask that you'd want to reflect on after this great conversation. Naomi, I'll give it to you first.
Yeah, I would just say that when delving into someone's personal painful past, it's good to just acknowledge up front at the beginning that I know this is going to be really difficult, and you can take breaks if you need to. You can end the conversation if you need to. If they're not someone who's media savvy, you can explain to them how you can go off the record if you need to, and what that means, and how that would mean that I can hear it, but I can't necessarily put it in the article, and you can't take it back once you say it, but that kind of thing. I just think that we sometimes just rush into the interview, and it's good to just acknowledge that this is hard, and I'm sorry, and I'm not trying to cause you pain, but I do want to try to get the facts.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, what do you say?
I'd say this is the past 5-10 years has been a really strange and tumultuous time for journalism, with a lot of things going on, a lot of challenges, and a lot of folks who are out there putting out news, but who don't have that that dedication or that commitment to facts and truth. And so what I would stress for students, remember why we do this, and always try to make sure that as much as possible about a subject, and that then you try and go and find those first tier sources that are going to give you the real facts, as real as possible, or the accurate information, and then you start to get to the truth of a story. And that should be your driving force. Is I'm going to get as much truthful information as I can, as much accurate information as I can, and that will lead me to write the story that's a real story, that's a truthful story, and it's a story that people are going to take with them and it's going to affect them, rather than just spouting opinions, or just making stuff up, or cutting corners.
Yeah, I would say find mentors and ask them a whole lot of questions. Learn from other people. And I know sometimes it may seem kind of scary, or you might seem like you're being pesky or whatever, but I think sometimes you can find reporters who would be flattered, that a elementary or high school kid contacted them and said, hey, I'm learning to report. How do you handle sources? How do you handle sources? How do you find people to talk about stuff? Have a list of questions that can help you with whatever it is that you're doing, because none of us knows everything, and it can be really interesting and fun to connect with people who do what it is that you're interested in doing. So good luck with that.
Yeah, and that's the great point. I think we said from the beginning that we work with middle and high school students, and the idea of just going out and telling stories and understanding the world, and realizing the world, but also sharing the world and what you see. And it's storytelling. Journalism is storytelling, but with these principles that we just learned of getting it right, trusting your information, also opening yourself up to information, so that you can go out and tell the most accurate, informative, trustworthy story. That's always the goal. And I think developing the source is the utmost importance and the priority. So great. I want to thank you all for your conversation. I want to thank our readers. I want to thank Apple TV. And there are many sessions going forward. So please consider them. And also please consider the award we spoke about earlier. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you.